You're listening to Becoming Wildly Resilient, brought to you by University of Kentucky Human Resources, Health and Wellness. Together, we will discover how we can thrive at work, home, and beyond.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Becoming Wildly Resilient Conversations. My name is Sebastian Calmes. I'm a wellness specialist with UKHR Health and Wellness. Today on the show, we're talking about bridging differences, how respectful communication and curiosity can affect our livelihood and well-being. To talk with me about this awesome topic is Dr. Jess Dominguez. Jess, thanks for being on the show with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I want to say this is my very first professional podcast experience, so I'm excited. Yeah, I'm Jess Dominguez. I'm an assistant professor here at UK in the Department of Communication. I study interpersonal communication and mediated communication and how those two overlap. Think about all the ways that you talk to people in your life, both in person, but also through phone calls and texting and through social media platforms or other messaging apps like Snapchat or WhatsApp. Basically, how do we do the everyday experience of our relationships through those mediated spaces?
And how did you land at UK?
Great question. At the end of my PhD, I went on the job market. I applied for an open position in my department. I did the full dog and pony show. I came out here, gave my presentation. Thankfully, they liked me and they offered me the job. I was excited to come work at UK. It is an R1, Research 1 institution. And I say that I prioritize my research in my career. So it was very attractive and very exciting to be working at an institution that prioritizes research and offers a lot of resources for research.
I'm glad to hear that, and I'm happy to be on the team with you here at UK.
Yeah.
From your experience, what does it mean to bridge differences, and how does that affect one's well-being?
Big question. When I read this question, I thought about a couple of different things. One, the well-being aspect. One of the things about bridging differences and well-being is there's usually a relationship there at the core of it. In my research, the take-home message is having a relationship, multiple relationships, is always going to be positive for your well-being. And I think people sometimes see those as two contrasting things, that you can't have a relationship with differences if you want to have good well-being. But I think part of being in the reality we live in is having a lot of various kinds of relationships, whether that's in the workplace or with your friends or in your family. You're managing multiple different kinds of relationships and different aspects of yourself. Having those connections in your life ultimately allow you to have certain resources that are important for your well-being, like being able to rely on people, whether it's for instrumental goals at work or more emotional goals with your friends and family, going to somebody for advice or for comfort or for solace. Having those resources available to you will make a huge difference in your day-to-day well-being. And if you look back, I always had someone who I could count on. I always had someone who I could help or who could help me. And that you could comfortably say, on a scale of 0 to 100, I feel pretty good about where I'm at in my life and my relationships and how that might affect my mental health.
Do you think somebody's ability to bridge differences affects the health of their relationships? If somebody's good at bridging differences, are they going to have a wider pool of relationships as opposed to somebody that doesn't know how to handle disagreements or conflict?
Yes, absolutely. I think there were a lot of pros and cons to the cancel culture that became popular a few years back. To an extent, it made people more transparent with themselves. If they had somebody who was toxic in their life or somebody who wasn't bringing good energy, the idea was that you should cut those people out of your life for your own well-being. But it feels like that's almost half-baked. Sure, you could cut these people out or cancel them from your life, but that's also under the premise you're going to ignore every other aspect of the relationship you have with them or have had with them, or every other part of their personality, with this one that you might be different on. Bridging differences in cancel culture plays a pretty important role in maintaining friendships, especially longer term friendships. It's only natural that people grow and change over time.
Absolutely.
And as you're growing and changing, you might be different from the person you were 5-10 years ago, even though you still have the same friends. And we want to hope our friends and our loved ones grow and change the same way we do, but that's not the reality of how things happen.
Right.
Just because you and your best friend both liked chocolate ice cream 10 years ago, and now they like strawberry and you like mint chocolate chip, you're not going to immediately end a friendship that's been going on for that long. Obviously, that's a very superficial difference. There were relationships that were ended over much more serious matters, like people being more open about certain structures in society, certain issues related to class, gender, and race. People became a lot more cautious about what it meant to have differences in their relationships. And during this cancel culture moment, people thought there's no way we could still be friends if we're not going to see eye to eye on everything, but especially this particular thing.
Do you think that's a lazy attitude?
I don't know if lazy is the right word. I think it's like too soon, too fast, like a knee-jerk response. Because when someone disagrees with us or our opinions, that feels like an insult to us. That feels like they're telling us we're wrong or we don't have the right opinion. Especially coming from someone who maybe prior to that, you felt like they were validating your opinions and your experiences because you had the same opinion. And when that happens, I think people felt it's bad for me if we are still in a relationship.
They don't feel safe anymore.
They don't feel safe. And maybe what the original argument was, we just don't see eye to eye. You're not the person I thought you were. But if we investigated deeper, are they any different than the person they were? If this is something they felt, wouldn't it be something they always felt at some point? And of course, things develop over time, but a lot of our opinions are more interconnected than we think. When you are faced with this key difference in someone, you notice a change happens and you know it's different from you. Do you approach it with the idea they're on that side and I'm on this side? Or do you approach it with more of a curiosity, like, why do you feel that?
Yeah.
You were saying X, Y, or Z back then, and now you're saying this, and those two things feel different to me. Can you explain how they're not different to you?
Right. Because it's a reaction and we don't have the curiosity to first ask, why are you coming from that perspective? Why do you think that? Why do you think we jump to defense? Where does the curiosity go?
It feels like it's more natural to be defensive because, again, when someone is of a different opinion of you, it might feel like they're trying to tell you you're wrong, even if they're not. When our friends are saying vanilla ice cream is better than mint chocolate chip, they're not explicitly saying you're dumb for liking mint chocolate chip ice cream, but it feels that way.
Yeah.
A lot of the times when we hear our friends saying they now believe in this idea or support this idea over an idea that we believe in, we assign a lot of meaning to it and where it's coming from. But sometimes we might not want to ask, or we might lack that curiosity because we might be afraid of what the answer is. We might be afraid of
That we could be wrong.
that we could be wrong or wrong about our opinions, but maybe we were wrong about who we think this person is. Especially if it's a friendship that's only been going on for 1 or 3 years. You're still getting to know this person. You've been friends for a while, 2 years, but you haven't known them their whole life. So when you're asking, why do you believe in this, or why are you saying these things, you get to know a side of them that you don't like anymore. And it might create even more distance between you two.
There's a lot of perceived risk to being curious about why somebody thinks what they do.
Oh, yeah, it's high risk, high reward. Because on one hand, you could learn from their perspective, understand them, and understand each other at a deeper level, and that might bring you guys closer together. But on the other hand, you might not like what you hear or agree anymore, and where does that put the relationship?
I've noticed on certain points of contentions with my friends, if I was courageous enough to be curious and go into the topic with them, I found I learned something. In that moment, it's hard to admit I didn't have the whole story. But then I'm happy I went through it all, because now I am enjoying the position I'm in much more than before the conversation.
Yeah. Growing up, I had a few memorable, huge fights with my friends where maybe we didn't talk for a couple of months. And while it was happening, it was awful to not be in contact with those people and to feel like that relationship was lost. But whenever that happened, once we came back and hashed things out, it felt like we were much closer.
Stronger.
Yeah, the experience of the fight, maybe it helped us to air certain things, but it primarily helped us to see each other in a deeper way, have a deeper understanding of each other. Going through the whole process of managing the tension or the conflict also signals to each other this relationship is above whatever this topic was.
It's worth it.
It's worth it. Maybe you said something I don't understand or I don't agree with, but who you are in my life matters a lot more. There's obviously times where there isn't a lot to look back on, like a lot of good to look back on.
Yeah.
And that might encourage you to let something fizzle out as opposed to trying to rebuild it.
I have a phrase I'd like to get your opinion on. It's, do you want to be together or do you want to be right? How do you feel about that?
I think that's a pretty good idea in thinking about interpersonal conflict. There's this model for understanding different responses or communication styles during conflict. It's called the EVLN model. There's 4 different approaches or ways to manage conflict. It's exit, voice, loyalty, and neglect. They go on different parameters of active or passive. The most beneficial one tends to be voice, when you are upfront and clear about what's upsetting you, why you're upset about it. The other positive one, even though it's passive, is loyalty. You're not going to explicitly say why you're angry, or you're not going to investigate it, but you're going to stay with it. You're going to stay loyal to the relationship, even if that means not saying anything. The other 2, exit and neglect, are supposed to be destructive to the relationship. Neglect being you completely ignore whatever happened and just pretend like it didn't happen, which can lead to resentment building up. And then exit is considered the worst because it means you just leave. You just walk out. If you're in an argument with a romantic partner and you leave the room and walk out, that would be considered an exit approach because you don't want to be in the conversation anymore. Whereas voice or loyalty, you're going to stay there. Voice is more active. You're going to try to communicate through it. And theoretically, that is a great idea, to be able to talk about how you're feeling and what upset you and why you're concerned. But I think timing is also important. And sometimes we forget about how important it is to time our communication and our messages. In the heat of the moment, even though we might want to say something and we might want the other person to know how we're feeling, it's important to take a step back and look at the context. Is what you're going to say going to be just as important tomorrow or after a few hours? Is that still how you're going to feel? Is that still how you're going to say it in a couple of hours? It's not that you're never going to tell them how you feel, but thinking before you speak, kind of a thing. In that moment, maybe just let things sit. Did I want to say that because of what was happening in the moment and maybe how I was feeling? Or is that consistently how I feel about the whole situation?
What do you think about an approach where I realize I'm losing my ability to have a mature conversation, a respectful conversation? I staged an exit. I'll communicate, hey, I'm losing my ability to have a productive conversation and I need to step away from it. Is that a decent strategy?
I would totally agree. I would say that still falls under voice, even though you're technically exiting the situation. It's not like you're leaving abruptly and slamming doors on the way out.
Gotcha.
You're still being very self-aware and empathetic to the other person, because how would they feel if you just left in the middle of a conversation, no matter how intense it is? Being able to recognize yourself to say, this is not going anywhere, we're talking in circles. If I stay in this room, it's not going to lead us to anything better. We just need to take a minute and then come back to it.
Yeah.
Recognizing that is hard, to know when to stop. What's that old saying? You shouldn't go to bed angry. I get the sentiment behind that in an ideal world, but what better is it to just talk in circles all night? I understand those phrases in an ideal situation, but sometimes it helps to put a pause and maybe go to bed angry, but go to bed, sleep, think about it subconsciously, and come to it with fresh eyes. It's almost like when you're running into a problem at work. If you can't figure it out, step away and come back to it. So,
absolutely.
yeah.
What are some common barriers to bridging differences? Could it be pride, ego, arrogance, hubris, or some other unknown factors? And how would you overcome those barriers?
Those factors like pride, ego, arrogance are all the things that we think of first. But I feel like the larger obstacle is just the skill of communicating. It's something we do all the time, but we don't know enough about it. Hence why there's an entire field of study for communication. And that ends up being the biggest hurdle in trying to bridge differences, is we don't know how to communicate effectively given the relationship, given the context, given the situation, but also what mode of communication. Are we talking in person? Are we talking through media?
And which is the best choice for the situation?
And I think people think we learn them inherently, but so much of communication gets misunderstood and misinterpreted, which I think also adds into the differences we see. I had a professor in undergrad who used to always say it should be one of the classes we learn in K through 12. It should be up there with English, math, and social studies. The further on I've gone into it, it makes a lot of sense, because most of the time we don't realize it, but we're trying to make sense of all the messages we're getting every day from people and from entities. It's all over the place, which is what makes it difficult to understand. I ask my students, think of all the ways you can say okay in a text and how each one of those things will mean something different. And if you're not using it in the way one person knows how to use it, they might interpret it as you mean something else, because okay, the two letters okay, is different than
spelling
KK
out okay,
or OKAY.
Or the thumbs up emoji.
Or the thumbs up, or just the letter K. And all these variations of that single word or phrase have such different connotations and can have such different relational implications depending on how the conversation is going. I don't know if you've ever seen the show Key and Peele. They have this one scene where they're texting each other, and the way they're texting and reading it to themselves sounds one way. They're reading the message and they're interpreting. One of them thinks they're getting into a fight.
Yeah.
And the other one thinks, oh, this is going so well. That's part of the issue when it comes to bridging differences, is if we want to communicate with somebody who has differences with us, do we know how to communicate effectively? Step one. How do I talk to this person who we don't see eye to eye on something? How do you pivot in the moment to communicate with someone who maybe you thought you saw eye to eye on something, and as the conversation is evolving, you're realizing we are on two different sides of this plane. It's hard to know ahead of time when you're going to encounter differences with someone. When we're first getting to know people, we're a little bit more aware of that. If we're going on a first date, we go through our own mental checklist and we might prepare for certain conversation topics that our standard first dates. What do you do? How did you hear about this place? What new shows are you watching? Things like that. We might be prepared for encountering differences when we're first getting to know people, but we end up being more surprised once we've already gotten past those initial developmental stages in a relationship. That's where it gets more complicated, because people are trying to make sense of how can we be so similar on these 10 things that are important to me, but these two values that are really important to me, somehow we can't see eye to eye. That creates even more confusion for people and more miscommunication, because they're trying to make sense of how can we be similar in these ways but not this way.
It's like an expectation is built up that somebody's going to continue to be like you if they were similar to you in the first 10 ways.
Yeah, definitely. That tends to be one of the primary predictors of a relationship across relationship types. Do you have some kind of common ground with this person? In the beginning, it's very surface level stuff. We're into the same kind of music. We're into the same movies. We like to do the same hobbies. We both like to go hiking, painting, or things like that. Those initial similarities are enough to keep the relationship going. Then as you get to know them, you're unintentionally looking for how similar are you in core values. Like I cherish people who are compassionate to others, people who appreciate a random act of kindness or service to friends. When we start getting into those deeper core values, even if we're not telling ourselves, oh, I hope they really see the good in volunteering, we may not tell ourselves that explicitly, but as it's developing, we're having an ear to it. We're like, I hope these things happen. There's this theory called self-expansion theory, and the whole premise is people want to grow as individuals. You want to continue to learn and become a better or a more idealized version of yourself. One of the ways you can do that is through forming and maintaining relationships with people who have different skills than you do. The idea is you have these relationships, and the closer you become with these people who are different than you, their different skills become yours, and your different skills become theirs. So you're self-expanding, but you're also growing together. And it puts a big twist on the idea of similarity in relationships, because, as I said earlier, that's a strong predictor in whether you're going to become friends, date someone, get along with that family member if you have some common ground. Self-expansion theory argues that might not always be the case. You might be attracted to people who are different than you. The opposites attract idea. How do people try to grow while being friends with people who are different than them?
Yeah.
It's popular in long-term romantic relationships, because if you do new and different things together, that helps you grow together as opposed to doing the same date night routine. But in that theory, I'm more curious in friendships, when do you start to look for people who are intentionally looking for people who are different from you? And maybe it's not intentional. Maybe people just gravitate towards these people who have differences in surface level things. They might dress differently, listen to different music, hang out in different spots. I want to learn more about that, and I want to pick up on that information. And so they become friends, and then you teach each other things.
Yeah. Going off that, I've been thinking about my friendships, and I have friends that we agree on many things, and we think similarly about many things. I have other good friends where we're more inclined to argue with each other in the best sort of way. But I find it's nice when there is a little bit of tension and friction. That is odd, though, because am I saying I crave a certain level of tension sometimes?
Maybe you're just looking for new ways to self-expand and looking for people who can help you self-expand. Most of the research in self-expansion theory has been framed in a positive light to say being friends, being married, dating someone, or having family members who are different from you doesn't necessarily have to be like, and that's where the relationship ends. To tie it back to that curiosity perspective, self-expansion theory is like, what if this was an opportunity to learn something new about yourself, about the way the world works. I think not everyone has to be friends with people who are completely different from them, because I think we do still also want the best of both worlds. We want people who are like us, but we also want people who might challenge us and let us see the world in a different light.
We want different, but not too different. We want different at a pace that is agreeable with our desire for self-expansion.
Yeah, I think we want different in a way we can control it.
But we can't always control it.
No, we can't always control it. I think that goes beyond self-expansion theory. When people are able to maintain relationships that have those differences, self-expansion theory comes in nicely. When differences bubble up in a relationship, maybe unexpectedly, that's more when we see tension building up. Then maybe we won't see it as helpful tension.
It sneaks up on us.
It sneaks up on us and ends up being more what is negative. You weren't expecting to disagree with this person or to disagree about this topic. Sometimes it's more of the surprise of it.
Yeah. Like you said earlier, do I even know you? Did I even know you?
Right.
Yeah.
And that can range from a lot of different things. But when we think about encountering differences in our relationships, whether or not we expect it, and especially if it's on an issue that's important to us, those elements combined end up having a bigger impact than the difference itself. It's more like the perception of the situation.
Thinking about if there are any times when we need a boundary. When we talk about bridging differences, we're talking about meeting somebody halfway or crossing a bridge, basically trying to make a connection. Are there instances where no attempt should be made to bridge a difference?
Yeah, you put it well, where it's like two sides of the coin. On one hand, if we bridge differences, we might be fostering a good connection. But then on the other hand, is this going against our own personal boundaries? In terms of, are we making compromises for someone who is toxic or abusive and is not actually going to help us in some way or help our well-being or foster a sense of connection? That's tricky to know where to draw the line exactly, where to place the boundary. I think people would inherently be more willing to draw that line out further with someone who they've had a longer or closer relationship. Your best friend of 15 years is now suddenly saying things you don't understand and you can't agree with. You're not sure where it's coming from. It feels like it's taking you by surprise and you weren't expecting it, but this is your best friend. They are a key player when it comes to who contributes to your well-being. In those situations, we're willing to make compromises on our own ideals to save the relationship. But depending on what those people are saying and what those differences are and the compromise that you're making, what if that ends up hurting your well-being? What if being around these people and hearing all these ideas you see as negative, what negative consequence does that have on your well-being? They always say in a compromise, nobody wins, even though they say it's like a win-win. I get this and you get that. But at what point does a compromise sound more like a lose-lose? You're trying to save this best friendship, but at what cost? How much of what these people are saying or believing is more hurtful to you than the benefits of the relationship? That's a clear-cut example. And I don't know how often in reality it ends up being that clear-cut. When I think about people who have cut off friends over the last few years, it always ends up being tricky. Even now, it's not surprising to think back. Was that what I should have done? Should I have tried harder to bridge these differences or to mend whatever happened? Has my well-being benefited more now without them in my life than it would have if I had tried to keep that relationship going? It's one of those things where Trying to draw that line, support and reinforce our own boundaries is not an easy choice to do depending on the relationship. Especially with family. How flexible are we in the differences in our families?
This is highly variable.
Yeah, it's highly variable. Some of our most generalizable factors would be if you've been friends with them for a long time, or if this is a very close family member. It's trickier with family members because are you going to cut them off? Are you going to completely stop talking to them? What about at family events? Are you not going to family events now? It carries a lot more weight to it than if you were to cut off a friendship or a romantic relationship or a coworker, where you can also prevent future interactions. But with family, especially immediate family members, parents, siblings, maybe grandparents, it is much more complicated. Just because you want to stop talking to them, does that mean you will stop seeing them? Is that what motivates people to get flexible with where they draw their boundaries in terms of bridging differences? If it's with a family member, are we more willing to stretch the line because we know we will have future interactions with them? And because of that, we don't want to disrupt the family ecosystem when it comes to differences of ideas, of opinions, of where people stand on things in a family situation. Sometimes it ends up being like, we will make this work. We will find the middle ground somewhere because we are a family.
But then sometimes it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And I also know people where it's just gone. And they
absolutely.
have to move on from that.
I think the worst part about that is having to give up the entire family and having to lose not just one relationship that has differences, but the entire system that it comes from.
Yeah.
That is a very difficult choice to make when it comes to a disagreement with the family member. Are you willing to cut it all off, depending on how close your family is? You may be having an argument with your father, and that might impact your immediate family, your parents and siblings. But if you're in a very close-knit family where even extended family members like aunts, uncles, and cousins are all closely integrated, does that mean if you stop talking to your dad and you don't want to go to events where your dad is at, you're also giving up interactions with the rest of your family? That's a very complicated choice to make.
Yeah, absolutely. I found this study where researchers looked at Manchester United soccer fans. They completed a survey identifying themselves as Manchester United fans. Then they were asked to walk through campus to a different location. And the researchers planted a runner that was going to trip. The runner was going to have either Manchester United...
Or like a white T-shirt, or a plain T-shirt, I should say.
Yeah, or the rival team's jersey.
Yeah.
The runners that had the Manchester United T-shirts were helped more. When they fell, the participants were like, "Oh, are you okay?" Like they had a lot of commonality really quick. Whereas the white T-shirts, it was more of a neutral response. Then the runners that had the rival team's jersey, fewer of the Manchester United fans helped them up. Later, they brought in the Manchester United fans, and instead of them self-reporting as Manchester United fans, they were identifying as soccer fans. What they noticed was when the runner had a Manchester United jersey, the majority helped them when the person fell. But even when they had a rival team's jersey on, the majority also helped them because they had in their mind soccer fans. Oh, this is a soccer fan too. Do you think reframing how we relate to people, and more specifically even relating to common humanity, do you think that's helpful in bridging differences?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that also pushes people to think about the situation. Instead of saying like black and white, I'm here, you're there, I'm right, you're wrong. Instead, thinking a little bit deeper, this person is not from out of space. They are of this world. We are from the same country. We live in the same town. We might work at the same place. And even though these things feel like superficial identity markers, I think the study you're mentioning points out there's a lot of ways people can relate on, and the importance of it ends up being clear. It's interesting when they think about it, specifically a Manchester fan, like those people are my people. Whereas anybody who's wearing a different t-shirt, sure, we're humans together, or we're like on this campus together, but we're not like together. But when we take a step back, we're like, well, I like soccer, you like soccer. This was done in the States or?
United Kingdom.
Okay. If it was done here in the States, it's a smaller group if you're a soccer fan. But I guess out there it'd be like two football fans. Yeah, like American football. And so being able to take a step back, and in this experiment, it was a forced step back. We all have very specific characteristics about ourselves that make us unique, and we may identify with certain people more than others. But if we take a step back and broaden it a little bit, we end up having way more in common than we think we do. And even if we go in the opposite direction and we narrow down what is specifically important to us, we end up learning we have a lot more in common than we think we do. It goes back to this curiosity thing, to ask yourself, how different is this person? Are they 100% completely different being that I am? Or is it one thing we disagree on? But outside of that, we like the same kind of music.
Yeah.
We both enjoy getting the same entree plates at Panda Express. We both like it when the leaves change color in the fall.
Yeah.
You do have to find these similarities, because when we're getting to know people, we're not explicitly looking for all these things. But when we find them, we're like, oh, I like that too.
Yeah. Or even with values, like I'm thinking about political ideologies where you have Democrat or Republican, you have two people that really care about the well-being of the country and the people in it. I think when people can come meet on that level, oh, we're not that different. We just really care about the people around us and the health of the country.
Yeah.
I feel like that would be a tool, or in the same way as recognizing we're soccer fans.
Yeah. Let's say we go to a town hall. I'm not sure how well attended those are by the public, but the people there should signal to you, everybody here cares about this community to a great extent that they showed up to this meeting. And maybe they have questions, like thoughtful questions. And maybe it may not be coming from the perspective that you are, but they're here. They're with you in the sense they care about their community and they want what's best for their community. Maybe that's where the differences are, but framing it in a more abstract way around caring for your community could be helpful in facilitating discussions across political ideologies by just noticing that and reminding yourself they may not be saying the exact same things I would be saying, or they may not be understanding it from my perspective, but we are having a conversation together about this issue. And it must be something we both care about. If that were me, I'd have to have some respect for someone who cared as deeply as I did about an issue.
Because there's the similarity right there.
Yeah, that we both care about local politics, this community. And those are core values, like having those ideals and sharing them, even if they might get different along the way, it doesn't necessarily mean they're completely splintered.
Yeah. Well said. Jess, can you share a personal experience where you failed at bridging differences? What challenges did you face? What, if anything, would you have done differently? And what is the important lesson, if there is one, from the experience you'd like to share with listeners?
Oh, this might take me a minute to think about. Not that I'm like a perfect person. I've never encountered differences.
Nothing. I've never failed.
What are you talking about? You know, I can remember getting into this big fight with my brother when I was an undergrad, and I can't entirely remember what we argued about. I might have been sharing something my class was discussing, and he said something that really threw me off, and it was not what I was expecting. At first, it was just a little disagreement at the kitchen table. Then I kept pushing. But why do you think that? Why are you saying it like that? I think he was not budging on his perspective.
Without giving any why.
No, he was just like, well, why aren't I allowed to think that? Why can't I have my own opinion? I think I kept pushing back, almost to saying, because your opinion is wrong. Like, how can you say that? How can you think that? I'm pretty sure I stormed out of the room. And then I don't think we spoke for like 2 weeks. So I used to commute in undergrad. I think almost 2 weeks, we did not talk. I remember I would leave extra early and stay extra late on campus to avoid interacting with him. And if I did go home, I would stay at a friend's house until nighttime. It was almost time to go to bed. I don't remember exactly how we mended that issue, but we did. Looking at it now, I think I did everything wrong. I did almost everything opposite of what we've been talking about.
Well, I noticed there was the surprise.
Right, yeah. Right?
And then the exit.
Yes, yeah. Looking back, I think what ended up frustrating me more was he, in that moment, was not the person I wanted him to be. I totally stormed out, and I don't think I tried to understand his point of view. It was more just me questioning why he even had that point of view. So that's one thing.
So meaning there wasn't really a genuine curiosity behind it?
No. Okay. I think when I was asking, why would you say that? It was my way of saying, you're so dumb. Why would you think that? As opposed to being like, I'm not understanding where you're coming from. Can you tell me why you're saying that? Just not having that curiosity and instead just being defensive implicitly and trying to say his point of view, whatever it might have been, was wrong because it wasn't mine. I think that probably stemmed from because I thought we would have the same point of view on this matter. What frustrated me was he didn't feel like the person I thought he was supposed to be or expected him to be. And having that mentality completely ignores that people are allowed to be complex and multifaceted. Because I'm sure that I've said things to people they weren't expecting of me that didn't live up to their expectations of me. Yeah. And it is very hard to suspend your judgment, to say people are allowed to be as complex as they want. They can have as many sides to them as they want. And that is what we all say theoretically in our minds. But then when it happens, it can be hard to process, to accept people can be complicated.
Yeah. The lesson is to remember people are allowed to be dynamic, complex, diverse, evolving.
I think people are allowed to surprise you and allowed to ultimately have different opinions from you.
Because that is a right we enjoy for ourselves.
Absolutely. Yeah. When we have new thoughts or new ideas, we're like, and that's because I'm growing. So I think being able to give everybody else that same grace and that same room in our perceptions of people, that yes, I see you in this light right now. You have 10 sides to you. But as we're forming our impressions of people, we should also give them space in our mental capacity to say, this is who you are right now. But that might not be exactly who you are next year or in 5 years or for however long I know you. And you should be able to grow and change the same way that I allow myself to grow and change. And I do want to preface that argument with my brother. I think I was 20, so frontal lobe had not fully baked. Yeah, looking back, I had a lot of lessons to learn in terms of encountering differences, especially with people who you have more established relationships with.
Dr. Jess Dominguez, everybody, anything else you want to leave listeners with before we wrap up the show today?
Yes. If you want to have a good well-being, it is always important to talk to your friends in any amount. There's plenty of research on that. If you want to feel less lonely and have more positive well-being, it benefits you to make the time to call a friend, email them, text them, and talk about anything.
Bridging differences is all about how to have tough conversations, looking past bias and focusing on what is common as opposed to what is different. Being able to bridge differences is important to well-being because as members of a community, we don't live in isolation. We are diverse in race, creed, genders, opinions, and beliefs. As we continue to develop and evolve as human beings, it's important to remember our ability to connect with others is a critical component of our well-being. And through remembering our common humanity, we are more likely to see ourselves in everyone, lending to the mutual respect we strive to cultivate for each other. Just as important as bridging differences is knowing when and how to set boundaries in our relationships, whether it be with family, friends, supervisors, or coworkers. Knowing when to time communications and which mode of communication to use is just as important as what we choose to say when bridging a difference or setting a boundary. Before we can become expert communicators and effectively bridge differences, we must realize it's a skill that requires attention, education, and practice to develop.
Thank you for listening to Becoming Wildly Resilient. This podcast is brought to you by University of Kentucky Human Resources, Health and Wellness. We offer a wide range of online and in-person services to support the well-being of UK employees, retirees, and their spouses. You can find experts in mental health, personal resilience, nutrition, and physical activity. We're ready to meet you where you are and address your unique needs. To learn more about the work, life, and well-being services offered by UK Human Resources, visit hr.uky.edu/wellbeing. You can also connect with us on social media and YouTube by searching @UKY Wellness or by email at healthandwellness@uky.edu.